Such a classic song too. I love KLS. If you know me, you know that I grew up in the KLS era, and so like literally I love all of the albums, but I would say album 2 is probably my most favorite because it's what introduced me to KLS, or I was introduced to KLS during the second album, and I was probably, was I a 5th or a 6th grader? So that dates me how old I am. But if you grew up in that era during that time, like they were a group that like was like no other, and they had like the 90s like sound, if that makes any sense, and they were, you know, definitely ahead of their time, you know, with auto-tune and just the sound, and eventually that progressed within each album. But if you are if you grew up in that era where like bass was thumping and like people in their Honda Civics and Accords and Legends, I don't even think Acura's were like, it was before Acura's was kind of even like a big thing, and so like I feel like, and you know, everyone was at the park playing volleyball, and you know, like we were just, how do I say, I feel like that generation was just at its peak of like understanding, or maybe not even understanding, right? Like living through the emotions of our dual identities of being American and Hmong. And I feel like KLS was like a turning point of like being Hmong-American. And I say that in a sense of like the production of the music, the sounds, the you know, because we were so used to like more Hmong folk music and more like rock. Like you think about Sounders, because Sounders was around that time too, but they definitely were pre that era. And so and I think about like Luli Waku and like even Lu Yao, right? These people were definitely a generation ahead, but like there's a specific like more classic traditional like Hmong sound to their music, right, to their craft. And so I feel like KLS definitely, like, you knew these were Hmong Americans who were, you know, trying new things, and like I just felt like, wow, these were me in a sense, if that makes any sense at all. And it was like cool because it was new, and it was like R&B, and like, you know, back when like, you know, what was it, like Boys to Men and Jodeci and like Bill Biv DeVoe. I feel like if you were in that era of like music genres, you understood like what KLS meant to the Hmong community. That's my like perception and critique or whatever, but like I love them. They are my boys in the sense of like understanding and learning about love, young love, not just love, but young love, because I felt like that was also the time where like I was blossoming as a young lady, and you know, finding out what like heartache looks like, felt like, and I felt like the music was just giving me everything in my feels. A lot of times it was bad, but it was like bad in the sense of heartbreak or disappointment, and like one-sided love. But I think that's just part of growing. And so like, oh, I'm getting a little emotional about it because you were so young and like dealing with so much. I think at that era, that time, where I'm so glad I'm wearing glasses, where we were like trying to figure out where we fit in within like our community, because we were, you know, the Palais and the Mulai, because people were literally that too, and we were like testing like boundaries because
we were living in like two different worlds, and like understanding and not understanding like what it meant to be first generation like refugees and immigrants in a country where like we knew we weren't wanted, and our parents were just trying to survive with like limited resources and like abilities that they couldn't control. And we just like wanted to fit in so bad, and we knew that like many of us in that first generation were like opening the doors and holding doors for many, like whether it be for our parents, for our siblings, for our relatives, sometimes forced to do that, sometimes by default because we spoke the language or we were learning to speak the language, or we knew, not entirely, but we had more resources or capabilities to engage and to participate. And sometimes we were dragged to the table, like going to the doctor's office and, you know, translating, but we knew not at the time that we were a key in a sense for our parents. And I'm crying. Wow, I'm crying because it's beautiful, but it was so hard for first generation, because I feel like in my life now, being older, as much as I get really angry at my parents and elders, I can't also help but think like they've had it so hard and they're so strong and almost numb to the fact that they had to endure all of these things because of a war that like they didn't really ask for, but they also were put in a place where you had to choose. And it's, you know, war after war, battle after battle, fight after fight. With our whole migration of how we've come even down to Southeast Asia, like you had to fight so much just to exist. And how do you like not feel the weight of that, even though like no one asks you to fight, you know? And I'm referring to like currently now, but now the fight is very different because we live in a different country and there's a lot of other things that are like at the table. But I feel like at that moment in time when I was, you know, when we were in the 90s, like going back to KLS, it's about finding yourself, finding love, but finding yourself, knowing and learning how to navigate through, you know, the mainstream system of, you know, school, being a professional, finding out like what that looks like for you in your path, and then trying to balance like that world with like your Hmong-ness, you know, understanding that there will be definitely discrimination, microaggressions, all these things, cultural, racial bias, and your community and your parents who also don't understand like the things you're going through because they're going through their own things and their own trauma that's, you know, we know doesn't get processed. And so like, how do you do better when that's not really modeled for you in a way that makes sense for you as a person now, in a culture that you are expected to perform in, right? And so like, you then eventually adopt those values and that culture as possibly your dominant. Nothing wrong with that. That's just the reality of things. But I think sometimes, like even me, I'm very guilty of like not seeing where my parents and the elders come from because my individualism of like my feelings and my interpretation and my truth, you know, overshadows or like encompasses everything for me, which is true. It does, because that's my truth. But sometimes, you know, I feel like all my anger, resentment, and bitterness from things that happened to me, from the injustices in the world and within, I feel, my culture that's against me as a woman. It's a lot. And so KLS, get back to KLS, has been like in a lot of Hmong music. You know, Paradise, I was a huge White Shadows fan because I love the Hmong Green dialect, and so like that was really something that resonated to me, even though I'm Hmong white dialect. And so like music at that point in time was like something that like I spoke to my heart. I'm an empath, as you can tell, and so like music and the arts was always something that I appreciate it, helped me escape, help interpret things for me and help me process. And I just really appreciate. And so when I say I'm a KLS fan, oh my gosh, I am a fan not because of just their craft, but the meaning and the presence that they had, and what that I feel not only was for me, but for like my generation, and the transition, adjustment, and maybe coping mechanism that a lot of us had as young people trying to navigate a country that wasn't ready, didn't welcome, and didn't want us here to, one, exist, but also to prosper and to excel. And so it means so much more than like an R&B song or an R&B group. And, you know, these love songs or, you know, whatever. And so like, and that also speaks to their truth and their experience, you know, just in regards to being artists and being in an industry where like you're always in competition, even though like, you know, we're just wanting to do the best in our craft, but also like pushing boundaries and trying new things, and, you know, maybe breaking away from like the more traditional Hmong sound. And so, you know, they always got a lot of like criticism, I won't use that word, criticism about how they weren't ever live, and how they, you know, it's all like produced in this basement or their studio, and, you know, they're not real artists because they just, you know, put things on a computer or whatever. Now, I would say if that is to be considered not an artist, that's a lot of artists though who do that. It's not just KLS. I will also say I've heard them live. Granted, it wasn't the whole group. So if you are a true KLS fan, you will know at one point in time there was a subgroup called Bounce, and that comprised of, we say, Michael and Colin, who were the three youngest. It was more hip hop and like rap, but it was more urbanized, I feel. And they did perform one J4 at like the smaller stage when they started doing that. I think maybe that might have been the first year that they did that smaller stage. I remember because I think they were in their like these jerseys that they had. And again, the three brothers came on stage and they did perform. And, you know, rest in power to Gaw, their oldest brother who just passed. If you, again, are a fan, you might have seen videos. The brothers did perform a couple of songs at the funeral, and I just feel like people don't really appreciate them as much as like they should. And again, I'm biased because I am a really big fan. In high school, they had a fan club, and you can write to the fan club. And so I wrote to the fan club. I don't remember. I want to say I did write to a specific brother, and I want to say it actually was Colin, but part of me feels like I might have wrote it to Michael. I don't remember. And I remember how I wrote the top, because there was a certain font that I like wrote that I did when I was in high school. I like to letter a lot, so and I loved writing letters, and so I know I used that font, and then the rest of the letter was like whatever, and it was in like black ink. It's really funny that I remember this. I wrote to them the one time. Unfortunately, I did not hear back, but I do remember because on their CD jacket they had like their fan mail, fan club address, and so I remember I wrote to them. So yes, there was a live performance, and there was a subgroup at one point in time. I don't remember if that was like after album 7 or 6 or something like that, or maybe it was before, maybe around 6. And then they produced more albums after the fact, as the KLS group, all the brothers. And so, and I think that was really cool too, because they were an all brother group, where I feel like all the other Hmong bands at that time or groups were like, some of them were siblings, like White Shadows, I think they had a couple siblings in there. And then Paradise had like family members, but not, I don't think they had brothers. I don't remember, to be quite honest. Maybe they did. I know they had brother-in-laws. And then I can't think of other groups. And obviously Southern Rush, that is a sibling group.
I don't remember if they're all siblings. I don't think so. I think they're just a couple. Pat and I think either the drummer or the guitarist. Anyways, so yes, KLS like provided a lot for me, and so they always have a soft spot. And it's not even a soft spot. It's definitely a soft spot, but like they're on like um, on a different level in my heart, I feel. And so I always like swoon, or when they did quarantine karaoke on Facebook, like I would always request if anyone was karaokeing, or like Betty Tao, who plays piano and sings, I always requested or like liked all of his KLS covers, because again, I love their songs. And Betty, shout out to Betty, is also an amazing artist as well. And so I feel like his tone, his voice, he's just very talented. And so I'm in full support and appreciate his craft and sharing like his talents with everyone. So yes, I always like requests for KLS songs.